Tony Kinnett.
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 Host of the Tony Kinnett Cast.
Let's get down to business.
You're listening to the Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WYBC.
WCYTV.
Here on the Daily Signal.
Hey, welcome back to the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal, nationally syndicated first on 93 WYBC. It's good to be joined by Todd Schulte from Forward.us, moving America forward. Thanks, Todd, by the way, for making some time to talk with us a bit.
Oh, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. It's an honor to be here with you and talk to the listeners.
So to kind of get things up to the clear point, the Supreme Court's been, busy. A lot going on regarding executive order action, federal district judges throwing injunctions and freezes like Memorial Day parade candy. And we're seeing a lot of more foundational interpretations of amendments in the law being brought forward after, I don't know, what would you say, post-World War II, about 60, 70 years of kind of operating in kind of like a status quo regarding kind of legal precedent. Would you say that's fair to say about how long we've had kind of a pseudo stasis with a lot of amendments?
I think the way to think about it is obviously in the 50s and 60s, for example, you did have a lot of really large decisions coming out of the Supreme Court.
Yeah, I was trying to back right up against that point.
Yeah, and I think that what you've seen over the last couple of decades here is the court has moved in a different direction on some cases. But I think what we're also seeing here is an increase, and you saw this in the Birthright Citizenship case, which we'll get to, is both a question of how the court's going to rule on a number of cases, but also the interplay between the executive branch, district courts, and the Supreme Court, particularly around the question of kind of nationwide injunctions and executive actions. And that's been a trend that's really been kind of on the upswing for the last couple of administrations and certainly the last 20, 30 years.
Some of the most fascinating audio to me that I think I've ever tuned into has been the Supreme Court taking cases like the Birthright Citizenship case and kind of setting the birthright citizenship part of the case on the back burner, which is very unusual for SCOTUS. And then hearing the oral arguments really start to dig into the role of the Supreme Court, the role of the executive branch, the role of Congress, and then, of course, how that, I like the word you used, interplay with district and appellate court judges throwing out injunctions, stays, freezes, thaws, bake at 375 until golden. So when we start talking about the birthright citizenship, I think you and I probably fundamentally disagree on the interpretation of where that should be. And again, we will talk about that. But I think we can agree that the reason that we're talking right now, a guy who from the way that Ford operates is probably on the left side of the aisle, and then I over from kind of the right side of it, you're seeing a very crucial conversation in what gets defined in the next couple of months. Because once the gray area is no longer gray, then it's a lot harder to re-blur the lines. Am I saying that right? Yeah,
just to tell you about us, we're a bipartisan policy organization. Actually, the most recent big one we'd had was a criminal justice kind of common sense reform that the Republican governor of Georgia signed into law here. And look, it's great to be here and talk with people who we don't always agree with. I want to say that. I think when it comes to these questions of nationwide injunctions and the role of the court and the judiciary, I have had policies that I've personally supported that have been blocked by nationwide injunctions, and you have too. And I think the question here kind of comes
vice
from
versa.
Yeah, exactly. And things that, and nationwide injunctions that I think were rightly decided here. And I think that's kind of a big fundamental question here is particularly in a world where it's been harder and harder for Congress to legislate in the normal ways. There's a big reconciliation bill that got signed today. That's a party line vote. More and more is kind of this question of the role of the executive and the role of the court. And whether we like that or not, I think there's some things that need to get sorted out here that are actually not clear-cut partisan questions.
Right. And I think that the party lines have started to become a little more blurred as we've seen kind of the uptick in populism in both parties, as we've seen the kind of crystallization of the more I don't mean, when I say corporate friendly, I don't mean corporate friendly as an insult, but kind of the more establishmentarian parts of both parties. And I would say that because, you have kind of corporatist Republicans and corporatist Democrats and independents who do function in kind of the same way in the Senate, especially. Those are just examples that come to mind. And I think, again, you're pretty dead on the money that when we're looking at the particular authority, this isn't really a case of, I do like these injunctions, so they should stay. During the Biden administration, I thought that when the federal judge, I think it was from down in Texas, said that the Biden administration kind of couldn't tell Texas what to do in that temporary kind of injunction, I thought, well, I don't know if that's, even though I like the aim of the judge to promote good border security, I don't think that he has the authority to do so. And even if I don't like the injunctions now, that doesn't make them good or bad. This is a more fundamental constitutional issue.
Yeah, and I think, ultimately where we should end up is someplace where there are things where a nationwide injunction is more appropriate or not more appropriate. And when we get to birthright citizenship, I think very strongly both birthright citizenship is good. It's clear in the Constitution, as well as this is a really bad case. But if you look at example, what you saw over the last 8 years, there were a lot of cases filed in Massachusetts and in San Francisco under the first Trump administration. There was a tremendous amount filed, not just in Texas, but with like one judge in Texas during the Biden administration there. And I think this is a question which is, and I think broader than this, like what does it look like to be in a place where more and more policymaking gets made that way? And I think it's something that ultimately we should have a democracy that is more close to the people, representative of the people. And look, like that means sometimes like different sides will win, but then the voters get to say in a fair election, hey, we like that or we didn't like that. That's going to be a better outcome for everybody here.
Gotcha. I would probably say that my goal is to kind of crystallize the roles of different parts of the republic, not in contrast to a democracy, but that the individuals who have been granted representative power by the voters, and then those representatives appoint and confirm judges and give them a specific amount of power for a specific amount of time, that's honored. And so that we don't have people wearing more hats than they should, or not having the power to carry out the amount of authority that perhaps that position was envisioned. The reason that I've taken the first part of the conversation here to talk about this, I like building from the ground up. We can start from the top down and start, talking about why the 14th Amendment interpretation, this way, bad way, which clause. But if we start from the bottom, I think that sets us up to talk about the specific case in detail.
What they were actually talking about. Exactly.
Right. Yeah. Right. So to Pramila Jayapal on the 19th said, sometimes the Constitution can be unclear and we need a judge to interpret it. That sentence as a whole, not incorrect. She then says the 14th Amendment is not one of those cases. I do agree with her in that situation. She says birthright citizenship is the law, and if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen, which is the current interpretation. What Forward put out, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, because this key phrase here is the one that's in contention between kind of the right and the left here. Forward put, we agree, Representative, the 14th Amendment is explicit, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the U.S. This has been the settled law for more than a century. The question that there are a lot of people who have, so the issue in this case, but I'd say more broadly, is the sentence or is the clause and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Because how that gets interpreted, again, there are problems on both sides of it. There are genuine problems on both sides of it. How that gets interpreted changes a massive function of the authority that federal judges at the district level have to do nationwide injunctions on a whole number of things.
So let's just be really clear on the last phrase, and I'm so glad you brought it up. The good news here is actually they are quite clear who the exceptions are to that, which is basically foreign diplomats and if people are born in the United States, number one. The second would be that if there were a foreign army who had, come to the United States in control of territory, then they're not subject to the jurisdiction of it. Now, to go back to the 14th Amendment for a second here, the 14th Amendment was passed after the abolition of slavery. It was
1868.
Revocation of the awful Dred Scott decision. And the 14th Amendment at the time, actually, they debated this question of, okay, what happens to the children of essentially undocumented immigrants? And there was explicit debate at the time. And the opponents of the 14th Amendment very clearly said, he was a senator from Pennsylvania, we shouldn't pass the 14th Amendment because that means, I think they said, the children of gypsies at the time would actually be citizens. And the proponents of the 14th Amendment said, yep, absolutely. And then it was passed. And actually, I will say, and this is an example of sometimes your sides win or sometimes your loses. There was a senator who explicitly said he voted for the 14th Amendment because he believed in birthright citizenship. And he actually lost his reelection because of anti-Chinese sentiment in California. So at the time, this was actually quite clear. And there's been 4 court decisions since then making really clear that children of undocumented immigrants are guaranteed birthright citizenship.
So the issue at play here, and this is where I want to follow up with, when we're looking at the original intention of this particular incident, was not a case of, well, there are, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of potential children of the Romani people, or at the time, the Gypsy people, in the United States who are and I don't mean a burden in a negative way. I mean the weight of a populace on certain federal services, on infrastructure, on the economic system, et cetera, that we're essentially taking a framework when we use this interpretation here. And we're suggesting, well, what they intended was the modern situation up to date here. And I think that's kind of where the danger lies, is that by suggesting, well, they meant this, and because they meant, that there were arguments about the children of the Romani, of the Gypsy people, that means in the same way that individuals who come from China into the United States, like the documented cases we have, to have children in the U.S. so that they can have United States citizenship, or has been the case with illegal immigrants or migrants who have immigrated illegally and not going through the port of entry process from Central and South America, have done the same thing to create an anchor point, which I understand from their perspective, because that's how that precedent's been interpreted by United States courts. You get into a real problem, a real serious issue, because the original intent of the 14th Amendment was not to aid in the anchor babying of the United States, which is how it has in fact been misused. And so I would argue that the Supreme Court does in fact have a role based on not just the Constitution, but legal precedent over the last 250 years, thank God, over looking at those circumstances and interpreting those as relevant to other cases of federal law.
There's a lot of things there. Let me kind of unpack them one by one.
Yeah, please.
I will go back to, I think they were incredibly clear at the time. And in subsequent Supreme Court decisions in 1898, the actual question then was, there were people from China who were excluded from being citizenship because of this Chinese Exclusion Act. They could not become citizens. And the Supreme Court ruled, well, if somebody is born in the United States, they are a child. That was a class of people who were excluded from becoming citizenships. And in subsequent cases, there's been 3 since then, the Supreme Court has affirmed this. So I think this is clearly established in law. I also want to say we do have a situation where there is today a larger undocumented population than we have had historically in the past. It's about the same size that it's been over the last quarter century or so. The reason for that, though, is not because of birthright citizenship. It's not because of a lot of things. It's because actually Congress has failed to, number one, pass immigration reform, and 2, we used to actually have an immigration system that caught kind of on the back end a situation where if somebody had been here for many, many years, there was a way for them to adjust status. We got rid of that, and that is what created a large undocumented population.
I haven't heard many on those that I would say were my contemporaries on this issue. I haven't heard many suggest that the anchor baby suggestion is the primary reason for illegal immigration, but it does in fact create an incentive. And an incentive structure does matter because we have documented cases of it. It's a very weird situation that has arisen that we've had so many documented cases of, that it's not, well, this is the reason for the mass. This is a critical issue that's being exploited situation.
I appreciate you saying this isn't really driving people coming to this country here.
By the way, I know that like we've completely gone over time. I don't care. Conversation's important. I'm really enjoying it.
No, I have as much time as you. I really appreciate it. Just so people understand how, if you're at home, how immigration works, because I know people hear terms that are out there. The actual thing that would happen in this case is someone would come to the United States. If someone was born in the United States, there may be an opportunity once that person becomes into their 20s to then go through an often like decades long process. So I just want to say, like, the idea, I have yet to meet, I work in immigration policy, I've yet to actually meet somebody who came to the United States for the purposes of having a kid, so that if they came today, sometime in the 2060s or 2070s, they might have the ability to adjust status. There's a legal pathway, but we're talking like a half century in a lot of cases here. Just so we understand practically how that might.
I don't
play
mean
out
as an
here.
anchor for citizenship, but as an anchor to stay in the United States with your child because of prior. I mean, you looked at this with Clinton in the 90s. There were serious cases that were discussed. And I'll have to find you the speech and send it. But Gingrich brought this up on the House floor, that you had individuals who were simply kind of using their children, as he said, a hotel key card. I think those were rather new at the time. Hence kind of the.
It's
the
a pretty
example.
tortured metaphor, putting a kid into a hotel, I think. But I'm not sure. I can just tell you legally, like, there are. And this is something that happens every day. There are families who are forced to be in a situation where there's U.S. citizen children and there's undocumented parents, and often those parents are subject to deportation and deported. There's 5 million or so mixed status people living in a mixed status family where that would be the case. So the idea that, like,
which is very cruel.
Well, and I think it's why we should have an immigration system, again, that people can go through. Look, I think there's probably a lot of things on immigration that we can broadly agree upon. I think if you look back to 2024, you talked about how the Senate works. People are mad at the status quo. They were angry that what they saw in the last administration was defending a failed status quo. And quite frankly, they were angry, not that, like, we should attack all immigrants and immigration, but they were really frustrated with what they saw at the border. And they were right to be. But I also think the American public believes that for people who are building their lives here, who overstayed a visa, who came here, who've been here for 20, 30 years, and that's millions of people, they should just have some process where they can go through, they can make sure that they pay a fine, they get right with the law. That's what we're advocating for at the end of the day, alongside the fact that we do believe the 14th Amendment is both clear on birthright citizenship, and also we want birthright citizenship because we don't want to see what we see in Europe and places like that, where you have generation after generation of people who are kind of locked out of the American dream because they're not able to be citizens.
So I'm very much in favor of the idea of creating a strong pathway and an easy to use pathway with limited amounts of bureaucracy for individuals to become citizens of the United States. But I do believe that, again, because of the situation in which a crime was committed, and we do have essentially a line of individuals waiting to immigrate legally into the country, that it does have to be a kind of back of the line situation. Again, of course, expand the process so that line gets moved through quickly. I think that's fair. But what concerns me is kind of the equation of the idea that, well, because there are people anecdotally in the group who are wonderful and who have been here 10, 20, 30, 40 years and have worked to live their lives and have been excellent, that therefore that's representative, like, of the group as a whole. Then you have the other side of the group who suggests that because there is in fact an issue of illegal immigrant crime that is in the United States, that therefore that's representative of the whole. Realistically, neither is true. And the reason we can safely say neither is true is because we don't know. That's a national security risk.
Well, I think there are some things we know, I want to say. And I appreciate that we agree that we shouldn't be, people are complicated and groups of people are really complicated. I think that's why, first and foremost, we should have a process that people can go through. I want to say that there. Number two, we actually do know a lot about immigrants and crime. And we actually know that cities and areas that have more immigration have not only lower crime on average, but have seen crime decline over the last 20, 30 years faster than other places here. Now, on the question of how people come to the United States, I think your point of, like, we should have legal immigration channels to the United States that make sense is a really good one. We have an incredibly outdated legal immigration system. I mean, the reason that so many people were showing up at the border in part was because the asylum system was one of the few places people could actually migrate to. And we believe in asylum, but we should have an immigration system that's kind of like healthcare. Like, asylum should be the emergency room. It should be the last resort. And we should have ways that people can come to be with family, to study in the United States, to flee places like Afghanistan and seek refuge. And we should have a process for when people here, it's not one size fit all approach. Some people are seeking asylum. Some people just need to be here temporarily. Other people can ultimately earn citizenship. But to get back to what we said before, that's all really hard in a world where we haven't seen good, meaningful immigration reform in 3.5 decades.
Right. And the issue that usually comes from the other side of this is, all right, well, we do want to begin immigration reform process, but in order to clean up the house, you first have to shut the doors. And the issue that I have seen, and the issue that many have seen, is that when discussing a policy in which, okay, well, if we're going to get what's inside the country fixed, and if we're going to get the ports of entry, the doorways into the country fixed, then the doors have to be shut first so that we know what we have, we know what we're working with. And essentially what I've seen so far from a policy standpoint, outside of just executive order action, is extremely weird measures put forward. Like, again, during the Biden administration, that bipartisan border bill, which was horrible. It was a ridiculously complex, convoluted, well, as soon as we hit this number, then the president has the option to do this if this secretary agrees, and if not, for only 15 days. It's ridiculously silly, and it also trivializes citizenship. Because when you have a system in this country, which is what we do currently have, in which the immigration system is so broken that you do have people who are in the country illegally. And I know you can use the word undocumented. That's not the proper legal term. They did not immigrate into the United States. They did immigrate, but they did not immigrate legally through the legal means to do so.
Well, about half of them did, and then they overstayed a visa. But I'll let you keep going. Yeah.
So in the case of their overstaying a visa, the proper, as you know, from immigration policy, when your visa expires, you are supposed to report that, and then that is to either be renewed or reviewed. And if you don't do that, that's considered evading federal authority. So that's illegal. Like if I fail to renew my driver's license and then I'm out on the roads, then I'm breaking the law.
No, I mean, I was just merely saying about half the people
who are
here undocumented.
I know that it's going to be a semantic conversation.
No. It's all right. And maybe I shouldn't have jumped in there. I think the point you raised, which is this kind of like Rube Goldberg thing, this on one hand where it's like
it does feel rather Rube Goldberg. You see the marble rolling down and the fans.
And then on the other hand, it's like we have to end all immigration. I don't think either of those things are the right approach at all. I want to be clear. I think it's good to say what you're for. So let me say what we're for. We think that we should have a new legal immigration system that actually makes sense for the 21st century, instead of a legal immigration system that was basically designed after World War II and has been modestly updated since. That way people come legally in the future. We think we should have a secure border, okay? And I think the last administration didn't do a good job at that. Now, I don't think that was a left versus right question. They kept a lot of Trump policies and they didn't do others, and they didn't take seriously that like people were going between ports of entry and getting into the back of a line for asylum instead of where they got at the end of the administration, building a bunch of pathways that were alternatives that were safer and orderly. And the third thing is, look, we should have a process that people can go through to earn citizenship. And in the meantime, because I don't think that's going to happen today, if we're being honest, for people who've come here who are dreamers, who have DACA, who have temporary protected status, who have fled countries like Afghanistan, have fled places that are incredibly hurt by war, we shouldn't strip away their status. We shouldn't fast track asylum hearings. People should have a fair process to go through. But ultimately, that's what we're for. And I don't think we should sit back and say, hey, we can't do any of these things until we do all those things. I think that has actually been a bipartisan mistake of a lot of folks here in DC. It's kind of bad establishment thinking. Like, let's be for what we're for and build the system and do the best job we can.
I think that's fair. I like the generalized framing of that. The issue that I think is that comes without the expectations of from policy that I have seen put forward on that realm, not from forward, but from put forward from different groups on other perhaps nonprofits or immigration study agencies that have suggested that it is a far wider door left open that doesn't address serious national security issues, and including, by the way, an expectation that groups and peoples who do enter the United States are expected to assimilate into American culture. And I don't mean American culture as in some idealized caricature that I've seen the left paint of the 1950s like white picket fence community nonsense. That's not what I'm talking about. But I do mean that the expectation to come into the United States and to learn the language of trade and to participate in the laws and the brokerages of the community, and that they are going to be subject to significant vetting as we have the opportunity to, not because the gross number of crimes are high, but because the individuals who do come into this country as illegal immigrants or illegally migrate into the country are, when they do commit crimes and they're part of various international gangs or other dangerous groups from around the world, the crimes that they commit are particularly heinous and are not supposed to be part of the population du jour of a country in the first place. So it's a national security breach. And I think that those questions need to be a part of the conversation so that they become frameworks of the policy. Like, we need to hammer out what actually it means to be a United States citizen and what that kind of a culture looks like for assimilation in order to actually build this policy moving forward. Well, otherwise, citizenship is kind of meaningless.
Look, I cannot tell you enough how much to come back to where we said the thing we started talking about with the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship. And we have gotten a lot of things wrong in this country. One of the things I think we've gotten pretty right was the original intent of the 14th Amendment. Now, when we talk about how people can come, they can integrate, they can contribute, I think there's a couple key factors we should keep in mind. One, keeping people locked out of legal status is making sure they actually can't do that. So we should give people that legal status, number one. Number two.
Well, they're not kept locked out of legal status. They're choosing not to speak with federal agents. That's their choice.
No, I really appreciate you saying that. The kind of fundamental nature of the undocumented population, not to go down too far in the weeds, is what's called the 3 and 10 year bars, which says if you've been in this country basically more than a year, you have to, for whatever reason, you've lost status. You're a student, you came here with a family member, you got bad advice, you've been here. Sometimes that's a mistake, sometimes it's not. Life's imperfect. It says you have to leave the country for a decade before you even try to come back. So I'll give you an example. I don't know. Do you have kids?
I do.
Okay. They don't ask you how old?
Two kids, a toddler and a baby.
Okay. So toddler and a baby. I'm going to assume your toddler's 3 years old. So if you were undocumented in this country, you'd come, you met someone, you got married, you'd had kids, but then you realized, I'd overstayed a visa. Okay. You were studying and for more than a year. The law would say today, what you have to do is leave the country for a decade, and then only then you can start to reapply to come back. So let's say you were from Mexico, okay? Or let's say, now you'd be trying to come back through a family-based immigration system. This would take you at a minimum 14 to 16 years to be able to come back. So that's to say, I think we should have an immigration system that doesn't say, you know what, like, this guy's a dad. He's building a podcast empire. He's contributing. How about an immigration system that says you can go through a process and stay here with your family, instead of an immigration system that says you have to leave and you hope that maybe you'll make it back for one of your kids' high school graduations? That's like a bad law as far as we're concerned.
What is like about 40%, just over 40% of the illegal immigration, at least according to the guesses of New York State. Again, it is in fact a guess. That we believe that's the percentage in this country. I am absolutely for a process for those individuals whose visas have expired, that kind of a 10-year lag ban, essentially. Yeah, I think that should be completely revised. And if anything else, that should be streamlined so that doesn't have to go before a judge in a case. I think the rules should be a lot more crystallized depending on situations. But there are a very large group of people in the country who have immigrated illegally and have crossed a border, who have come into the country via land or sea, who have not done that. It's not a visa overstaying situation. And I think that's when most Americans are looking at solving illegal immigration, the migrant caravans, for example, who are all working age guys in their 20s, the questions go up like, well, you're not overstaying a visa. That's not not the situation at play here. Yeah.
So let me tell you. Number one, I think you brought up caravans. So there are definitely people who are coming to the United States and have availed themselves of the asylum system because they don't want to live their lives in total desperation and poverty. And the United States is a place where they can get a little bit of a better job. They can send somebody back to their family. And by the way, that's good for the United States. Now, we should have them come in a different pathway. Asylum should be one pathway. But we should have a way where people can come to the United States for a couple of years and be able to migrate back. We've actually built these immigration systems that traps people in. So if they leave, they can never come back.
They can ask for asylum at a port of entry.
Well, no, they can't actually today, and they really historically have not been able to. But we should
Why
have an
not?
asylum system.
Hear me out. Hear me out. I
Yeah.
disagree with you here. Tell me why someone coming up through Mexico
Sure.
cannot go to a U.S. port of entry and ask for asylum.
They're right now barred from actually doing that. There is an asylum ban in place, and historically, there's not been a process.
For how all right. So I'm
Sure.
going to assume that the Trump administration has recently put that asylum ban in place.
Sure, but actually, historically, there's not been a process that people could line up at a port of entry and apply for asylum. That's actually really pretty recent and pretty limited. The Biden administration.
We have documentation and photos, though, of at ports of entry along the United States borders, though, that basically have like the laminated signs up and documentation up and ready for asylum seekers, like dating back to the late 80s, early 90s, though.
Well, so let me clarify a couple things. Number one, there is a distinction between being what's called paroled into the United States, so you can then seek asylum. But two, actually no, like the number of people who sought asylum at the southwest border was actually historically much, much lower than it's been. So let me explain why that's the case. Number one, because we have a legal immigration system that doesn't have a way for people to come to be with family, that doesn't have a way for people to come and work. And by the way, like the definition of asylum and the refugee program really come out of what happened in World War II. I'm saying we should have an immigration system that if you're hardworking and you want to come here, we should have a process you can go through there. And if you also apply for asylum, that's great. But this goes back to the point, I think one place we can agree is a high percentage of our immigration system was just going through asylum because things were outdated there. We should have a process, though, where instead of this heroic journey where, families and a mom gets a kid, they walk through the border. It's incredibly dangerous. I don't know.
But that's not the vast majority of cases, though. This is the issue that I have here. The framing, like when we actually see,
it's a lot of cases.
It is a lot of cases, yes. But that's a lot in the gross sense, not a lot in the percentage case. Like the vast majority of illegal immigration cases that we see, according to the government's own data, are guys in their 20s and 30s who are crossing the border and are caught. It's not all women and mothers and children scurrying across the border. Like that's just not true.
Well, I think the point I'm trying to make is, one, sometimes guys in their 20s and 30s do need asylum and should be refugees, number one. Number two, we should have a process for people to apply for asylum at the border, but it should be a last resort because we should build a bunch of ways people come in. Instead of that heroic journey of that family, we should be able to do how you would get from the United States or from someplace else in the United States. Get on an airplane, like get on a bus. Maybe it's to come work for a year, maybe it's not. But that way you come, you have a work permit, and you have different options available to you. I think that's like the sort of common sense approach. The reason we don't have that is because both parties have been playing with kind of a congressional deck that was set a long time ago. But I do think it's really important to keep in mind here, part of the problems at the border, most of the problems at the border, stem from a failed legal immigration system that really doesn't have good opportunities away from the border. So I just think that's a helpful way to think about it. Let's take pressure off the border by building it sounds boring to say, just kind of a diverse set of legal pathways for family, for international students, for different types of jobs at different wages, so that people can come, they can seek refuge by going to a third party. And if we do that, like nothing's perfect, but I think one place we can agree is making the process to pay the cartels to get you to the border, to go between a port of entry, to cross, to get on a bus. Maybe it's a Greg Abbott bus, or maybe it's a City of El Paso bus, to go to a city where you heard you can get this, that went really poorly. So let's build a better immigration system. But
we're in agreement.
I want to say
we're in agreement with that kind of policy for future construction. And I really do want to talk more, but I'm also remembering that in an hour and 20, I actually have to be on the air. So I'm getting lost in the fact that I'm really enjoying this conversation. I didn't even get to like the other stuff I wanted to talk to you about. So if you don't mind, we'd love to have you back just right away.
I'd love to come back. I'd love to talk about the things we're really concerned about with the Trump administration, like the Alien Enemies Act and due process and things like that. But I really appreciate being able to have this conversation.
Oh, yeah. Just to close on a positive note here, I would say that it's clear that we both want the immigration system to come into this country to be reformed and made a lot easier. I would suggest that if we can possibly delineate a good method of vetting for individuals who have come into the country illegally already, either through whatever means or way that they did, and then additionally, those who are coming into the country can be vetted as best as is possible, then that would in fact satisfy the reasonable individuals on both sides. Make it as secure as possible and as diverse and easy to access as possible is essentially the two-headed solution that I think most Americans would say they're looking for, at least according to the most recent polling. I think from Gallup, it could be Morning Consult. Don't quote me.
No, I mean, I think, and look, the particulars of that we can go back and forth on, but at a basic premise, if you're building your life here for whatever reason you're doing this, let's have a process people can go through a background check, make sure people have paid back taxes and fines. And again, you're just giving them a work permit and then a process they can go through that's going to take a long time to get through. But that sort of common sense approach is one we should be aiming towards. And it's going to keep families together. It's going to be good for the economy. And I hope it's one that we can eventually get back towards.
Right. And we didn't even get into the conversation of, whether or not governors can say our economy, our infrastructure can handle this, the resources, the Medicaid question. We'll have to leave that for later, as loath as I am to do that. But Todd Schulte, really appreciate your coming on.
Thanks,
Forward.us. We'll have you back on soon, because this is a conversation worth having at the very least. And
really appreciate
it's quite a lot more than that.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
We'll be back in just a second. Don't go anywhere. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast.
The Tony Kinnett Cast on 93 WIBC.
These may be the wildest, most intense horror stories, so awful, so evil that I might stick a flashlight under my chin and find a campfire. Of course, I'm talking about what the Democrats are saying about the big, beautiful bill. So all the way from the swamp, or our nation's capital, Bradley Devlin, our political editor over at the Daily Signal and host of the Signal Sit Down. So how has it been in that hurricane of insanity over the last 24 hours?
Little sleep, lots of work, and now we get to play the entire game all over again with the Senate, Tony.
Oh, I'm so excited. Because anytime there's a Republican discourse in the public, whenever you've got Republicans in the more moderate areas, or the purple and blue areas, the populists, the traditional conservatives, the establishment, whatever you want to call them, they're having a conversation about what they want in a bill. And the Democrats, they try to seize on the moment and say, look, infighting, look at this, look how terrible this is. And then they start trying to talk about the bill, and it just goes downhill from there real quick.
Yeah, it does go downhill for them fairly quickly. That's because they're not privy to these types of conversations. This is why the American people delivered a trifecta to President Donald Trump last November, because they knew the only way that this was going to get done, if you were going to unleash American energy, if you were going to secure the southern border, if you're going to revitalize our military, if you're going to do any of these things, you're going to need Congress, right, to make sure that taxes don't go up, et cetera, et cetera. Shocking. Some people have actually read the Constitution in this country still, and that's why people voted for Republicans down ballot as well. They knew that if they didn't vote Republican down ballot, it was just going to be an endless cycle of impeachments and hearings and procedures that would have not allowed the Trump administration to make good on its promises. And I think that's a major difference, Tony, with the way that this bill has gone down versus how things went down the first time in the first Trump administration. If we can go back, we can remember that budget reconciliation was the chosen tool of the Republicans in Congress to get rid of Obamacare. And out of nowhere, the late John McCain puts his thumb down and Obamacare repeal fails. But they had another bite at the apple with budget reconciliation. And so they went forward and they passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Big tax cut set to expire, of course, by the end of this year. And that's what they're looking to reinvigorate, to codify, if not permanently for the next 10 years. Certain provisions expire, certain provisions do not. But those folks in Washington, D.C., they were compromising with the president back in 2016, 2017, 2018. That's not the case anymore. People know and understand that the reason that they have been sent to Washington, D.C. is to enact the Trump agenda. These people won their elections because Donald Trump weighed in, because Donald Trump was on the ballot, and not in spite of Trump. That was the impression in 2016. The impression is much different now. And what do you get? A much more comprehensive, solid bill. that President Trump might have the opportunity to sign into law if the Senate does its part and the two chambers are able to reconcile.
And the truth of the matter is, there's really not a ton in this particular bill that guts a lot of programs that the Democrats were preaching from the rooftops. It was just going to be destitute horror here at home because, oh my gosh, oh no. I mean, it's just going to be, again, the end of the world. I hopped on this morning over on Merritt Street TV to a panel with Raj Goyal, former Democrat congressman, and he immediately starts into this long diatribe about how Medicare was gutted and scrapped. Essentially now it's like a used Band-Aid. That's the entire budget. And Medicaid, millions, tens of millions, tens of billions are now off of Medicaid. And here's a clip of Hakeem Jeffries saying the same kind of stuff that, oh man, Republicans are just lying when they say that illegal immigrants were ever given any access to Medicaid.
And under current law, undocumented immigrants are already ineligible for Medicaid, the ACA exchanges, and for SNAP benefits. Not a single undocumented immigrant in this country gets a dime in federal taxpayer dollars for any part of comprehensive Medicaid coverage. Not one. And so when we're talking about nearly 14 million people who are going to be thrown off their health insurance, millions of others who are going to be jammed up by this aggressive cut to SNAP, the largest cut to food assistance in American history. We're talking about American children.
Well, I mean, there you go. I mean, if Hakeem Jeffries says it's in the bill, you can take it to the bank, as his predecessor used to say.
Yeah, that is not what's in the bill here. The CBO estimate that the Democrats tailored to fit their needs, that's not how this thing is going to go down. And notice they never point to the exact provision of the Medicaid portion of this bill.
That's true. When you and I cite things, we like make a Twitter post or something. We usually post this thing called a screenshot with the text in the bill, maybe some highlighter action going on. They never do that.
Right, because the only real things here are preventing waste, fraud, and abuse, not only from individuals or illegal immigrants, but also from the states who have decided that they can take their federal dollars, because all the money is fungible, and direct other monies to illegal migrant care. Well, that is coming to an end, no longer. Future expansions of Medicaid in order to prop up the chosen populations of the Democratic base, we're not tolerating that anymore. No, thank you. You can pack up and go home. Now, the only other thing that they could point to then is work requirements. And please, I beg of you, Democrats, go in front of the American people and tell them that actually the person who does not look for or is performing work and is perfectly able-bodied should be given $50,000 to $60,000 worth of Medicaid care every single year. That's not how this should work at all. They are going to point to mothers. Oh, mothers with miscarriages, working moms. You're going to send a mom back to work because she needs to have Medicaid? No, there's exemptions for all of those people. There's exemptions for the disabled. There's exemptions. The only people not exempt from this thing are the able-bodied people living in their parents' basements, collecting government checks, eating government cheese, and refusing to do anything else. Those are the people that it's going after. And it's shocking to me that the abuse of that system is so large that they were able to find, $600 billion worth of cuts just by getting those people improperly on the rolls off? Yeah, shocking.
Absolutely. And I reacted the way I did in the middle of again, your list there, because that was the first line that Raj brought forward today on that panel. He's like, oh, pregnant mothers, they're going to have to be taking calls from, the labor wing. And I was like, what are you talking about? If you're going to criticize the bill, believe me, as a Republican, there's a lot of stuff one might criticize in this particular bill. Some of it leaves me a little bit salty, if you catch the pun. However, I really don't think that trying the same routine again, where you say, this bill is going to kill all the puppies and the kittens, and it's going to dump nuclear waste in your backyard, and it's going to force you to watch Rosie O'Donnell on the television. That's not really going to spook Americans, because I'm trying to find the crew that now takes everything that Hakeem Jeffries and Chuck Schumer and the anchors over at CNN and MSNBC, I'm trying to find the crew that's taking every word out of their mouths at face value. I really can't find them like we could 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Right. Screaming the children loses its effect when the previous Democratic administration loses 300,000 migrant children just into the interior of the country. And then people ask, where did those children go? And they just kind of go, I don't know. So that kind of caused them to lose credibility. And now I want to hit on something that you mentioned, though, Tony, which is there's plenty of things that conservatives might not like in this bill. And that is, I think, the thing that you have to remind people over and over and over again here, is that this is only the first half of the conversation. The second half of the conversation, when this thing happens to this, when this thing goes to the Senate and the Senate hashes it out, it could look very different. The question on everyone's minds in Washington, D.C. right now, Tony, is whether or not the Venn diagram of things that the House can pass and things that the Senate can pass overlaps at all. Because that's where you need to be. You need to be in the center of that Venn diagram. And the Senate doesn't want to touch Medicaid. There's the votes might not be there to touch Medicaid or reform Medicaid, anything like that. Or maybe, Josh Hawley has been making motions. He's not going to vote for anything that cuts Medicaid. Well, does Josh Hawley view work requirements as cutting Medicaid? It'll be interesting to see where he falls on that conversation. The Senate, not a big issue for them. SALT is not a big issue for them. So it's very possible that they want to provide pay-fors by stripping down some of the SALT deal. Well, is that a non-starter when it comes back to the House and Johnson has to go through this process all over again? We don't know. And so this is where the conversation is picking up now. But the goal for conservatives, right? Buckley had this quip where the person that I want to get elected is the most conservative person that can get elected. Well, I want the most conservative bill that can hit the center of that Venn diagram, that can actually end up on the desk of the President of the United States. And we can sit here and talk about the different provisions and quibble about the provisions. I think overall, the bill does more good than it does bad, of course. If that was the case, I wouldn't be supporting it. And, there was a series of political missteps, I think, on the part of House leadership, on the part of other people, shepherding these negotiations between the conservatives and moderates of the House Republican Conference that could have been avoided. But with what has happened in the past, this is the situation where we were. The SALT deal could have been a lot worse. The IRA provisions could have been repealed to a lesser extent. The tax cuts could have created even more deficits. Hard to think of that happening. And the spending cuts could have been a whole lot worse. And so when you kind of let it all come out in the wash, you think, okay, this might be the best bill that is passable in the House at this time, and it might be the best bill that can get to the desk of the president.
So, I mean, when you take that into account, I do like to consider, if I'm going to criticize the Democrats for not having a plan for a vision at all when they come and screech on the House and yell and throw things through windows, then I better have some kind of a vision. And I think that this is a great point of leverage to actually get the American people interested in midterms. You say, but everyone's already talking about midterms. What do you mean interested? I mean, Americans do not come out for the midterms like they come out for the presidential election. And if you do want Republicans to pass things, they're going to need a 60-vote majority in the Senate. You say, well, I don't know if that's going to happen, Tony. Okay, well, I was told after the 2020 election that everything was so rigged, we were never going to see the other side of it again. So what I'm suggesting is that perhaps if there are things that we do want in these that maybe wouldn't make it through in a reconciliation measure because the parliamentarian, her mustache is a little short, then one might think that we actually start describing why we need good representatives and senators in the House and Senate, not just guys who are given kickbacks to those in the blue states, if we're actually going to get some things reconciled permanently regarding both the budget and then not to mention a lot of executive orders codified.
Yeah, I think the codification of the executive orders is number one. If Republicans were ever to be so lucky to have 60 votes in the Senate, you might be a little bit more optimistic than I am. I think the reason that there's such a big sense of urgency right now is you need to get the stuff passed in a way that doesn't blow out the debt and deficit. You need to continue to find ways to pare back government spending and steer the ship of state in the proper financial direction before the midterms come around. And the traditional thinking on this lag time with respect to the tax cuts is, well, if we throw in the tax cuts or we keep the tax burden the same as it was, plus the another trillion or $2 trillion in tax cuts that Trump is putting into law on top of it, well, you're only going to feel the full effect of that from about 12 to 15 months after this thing gets done. So 2026, November 2026 is coming way sooner rather than later. And you need to make sure that the economy's humming and the people are feeling confident about what's in their pockets and what's in their bank accounts so that they can come and pull the lever for you. If you wait and you drag this thing out till November, December of this year, potentially even later, well, chances are the focus is going to be on those previous negotiations, and the full effect of the policy isn't yet going to be known by the American people. That's kind of what happened in the first Trump administration. So this needs to happen sooner rather than later. Senator John Thune feels the urgency. The new deadline for this to be on the president's desk is July 4th. Whether that actually comes to pass, I'm not sure at this moment.
Well, who is? I don't, as
Yeah.
much as I like to think of you as a palm reader and meteorologist, you're neither of those.
No.
Bradley Devlin, our political editor, not our clairvoyant, but I don't know. You and I have been right more than we've been wrong. Maybe that's why we both still have jobs. Thanks for hopping on, bud.
I think my career would be better if I was wrong more often, Tony. Thank you.
Yeah, then you land a sweet job at MSNBC. All right, we'll catch you guys later. It's the Tony Kinnett Cast here on the Daily Signal.